nothing will satisfy Republicans until the freedom of this country is achieved.
I just want to know why us? Why David?
They do clearly pose a very significant threat.
They are simply wasting their time, risking their own lives and risking innocent people's lives in a futile campaign.
We are not the dissidents, the Provies are the dissidents. We are the Republican movement.
The political talks here at Hillsborough seem set to end inconclusively. But the feeling is that progress has been made and that a deal will eventually be done to restore the Stormont Assembly. As part of that deal, the Republican movement led by Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness will be expected to demonstrate that the IRA's war is finally over. But out in the Republican heartlands, there are others who say they won't go away. Tonight, Spotlight examines the Republican dissidents and asks, do they pose a serious threat to the peace process? These pictures show members of the Real IRA at a training camp somewhere in the Republic. As politicians strive to find a settlement to finally end violence in Northern Ireland, a new generation of terrorists is being prepared for war. They show little interest in a political settlement.
We cannot envisage a ceasefire in any circumstances, other than in which a declaration of intent to withdraw from the occupied 6 counties is made by the British government.
Damien O'Cado-Goff is a journalist in Londonderry. It was through him that Spotlight obtained the pictures. He was contacted by a source and told to prepare for an interview with the Real IRA.
I was asked to put on a boiler suit, surgical gloves and surgical socks, large shower cap type things over my feet, and it was hooded. At that point a van came along and I was put into the back of the van. My equipment was put into black bin liners and I was ferried for some hours. I don't know how long I was away. My watch was taken from me, my mobile phone was taken from me, and all of my equipment.
When taken out of the van at an undisclosed location, he was met by a masked man who described himself as a member of the Real IRA Army Council. After an interview, he was allowed to film a member of the group reading answers to questions submitted in advance. He was ordered not to record any voices. Weeks later, a video of a terrorist training camp was left at his home.
I'd say this is kind of basic training that they were carrying out now here, and that
Paddy Triers is a former explosives and weapons expert with the Irish Army. We asked him to assess the significance of the footage.
So that would suggest that these are new recruits?
That would suggest that they're new recruits. The basic thing a recruit would have to do, first of all, is to be able to maintain his weapon, clean his weapon, otherwise the weapon wouldn't function for him. When she's being fired, you'll see where the flame comes out of there you see. She's short now, it's only that inches above his. Yeah. So she's a fairly modern weapon. You're looking at somebody explaining the function of an anti-handling device, which in this case seems to be a mercury kill switch bomb. That could be just a demonstration model, and especially when you can see through the container to explain to them like how a bomb works and all that kind of thing.
Would this be a fairly high level of
yeah, but like he has picked his components very well.
The Real IRA's ability to murder and maim was demonstrated in horrific fashion in August 1998. 29 people and unborn twins died and hundreds were injured when it bombed Omagh. The Provisional IRA ordered the group to disband after the bombing. It called a ceasefire, but it didn't last. The group's utter disregard for public opinion was again demonstrated after the attack on New York's Twin Towers on September 11, 2001. The depth of worldwide outrage ensured that from that moment onwards, terrorism was no longer an option for Sinn Féin and the IRA, or any group hoping to broker a political settlement. But it had no impact on the Real IRA. Less than 12 hours later, it tried to murder police officers in Derry. For them, participation in politics is a huge mistake.
they were never really interested in peace processes or anything like that, never at any stage. They were always, even when they were in the Provisional IRA, extremely uneasy with this whole notion of democratic politics. Their whole argument would be is that the IRA can never engage in constitutional politics because it is an underground army.
In August last year, the group used a booby-trap bomb to kill David Caldwell, a Protestant construction worker at a territorial army base in Derry.
It hurts so much. And the news, the guy can't realise it. I don't think he. And not realise it till he's back. But it was a shock. And I just want to know why us? Why David? You know.
There have been dozens of other murder bids, including the bombing of the BBC in London and attacks on police and army installations. The Real IRA is clearly still dedicated to terrorism.
The British continue to claim sovereignty over part of our country, and while that is the case, armed struggle will always be justified.
The Real IRA was formed in 1997 by Republicans opposed to Sinn Féin's political strategy. For them, the Good Friday Agreement and the IRA's decision to decommission weapons was a betrayal. Francis Mackey was a Sinn Féin councillor in Omagh for 16 years. He's now chairman of the 32 County Sovereignty Movement, which the government says is inextricably linked to the Real IRA.
32 County Sovereignty Movement are not a political party. When we were formed in 1997, it was clearly a single issue of national sovereignty, to highlight that the issue of national sovereignty was being again usurped by the British government, and that Sinn Féin leaders were moving to an internal settlement in the occupied 6 counties.
Morale among the volunteers here remains high because our analysis has been...
Marion Price, a former icon of the Provisional IRA, is a member of the group's executive. She and her sister were jailed in 1973 for their part in bomb attacks on the Old Bailey and 3 other targets in London. Once regarded as a friend and comrade by those who now lead Sinn Féin, she's now one of their most outspoken critics.
To go down the path they did, I find it unforgivable. The likes of Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, if they think that a war has to be fought for 25 years for seats in Stormont, they're very much mistaken. I don't think that is worth the loss of one life.
While they're opposed to all things British, a prisoners group linked to the organisation recently opened an office in a Belfast business park built with government assistance. The complex is now owned by Ortis, an independent business agency. We asked it why the Irish Republican Prisoners Welfare Association is able to rent an office in a facility built to promote economic regeneration. A spokeswoman said its remit included promoting social development and assisting charities. She said the association was entitled to rent office space because it's a charitable organisation which helps the families of prisoners. The spokeswoman said the group had to adhere to strict rules which prevent it from using the office for political activity, but not many charities have war news displayed in their office. The 32 Counties movement aren't the only Republican opponents of Sinn Féin. Others took part in a commemoration rally on the Falls Road in West Belfast 10 days ago.
They tried to convert a revolutionary movement into a reformist party within British rule. They went to Leinster House, they went to Stormont, they stopped the war for the first time in Irish history. Yes, they destroyed the weapons given to them for the freedom of Ireland.
Rory O'Brody is a former senior member of the IRA and a former president of Sinn Féin. He left Sinn Féin 17 years ago after the party backed Gerry Adams and voted to take seats in the Irish Parliament. O'Brody now leads Republican Sinn Féin. They want a federal Ireland with 4 provincial governments and a national parliament. They also view the Good Friday Agreement as a sellout.
We see it as a strengthening of British rule here, in that it aims to include the nationalist people actively participating in British rule. In other words, to make more difficult the job of ending the English presence in Ireland.
The bombing of the HÉireann Hotel in Enniskillen in July 1996 was the first act of violence by the Continuity IRA, widely viewed as a military wing of Republican Sinn Féin. It's a smaller organisation than the Real IRA and has been less active. Their political representatives say their violence is justified.
As long as the British government remains in Ireland, history teaches us there will be those in Ireland who will oppose that. And we uphold the right of the Irish people to resist British rule in Ireland.
Politically, there are differences between the two dissident Republican groups. Those who split with Sinn Féin in 1986 are critical of those who stayed until the 1990s because they agreed to take seats in the Irish Parliament. But they're united in their opposition to Sinn Féin. While many unionists believe all Republicans are part of the same movement, the reality is there is intense hostility between them.
98% of the Republican community have accepted that the Good Friday Agreement offers all of us the way out of conflict and a way of resolving peacefully and democratically those constitutional issues that have divided us in the past.
So if he believes that by doing what he has done and signed into is a move forward for republicanism, God help republicanism, because he has moved to administering British rule in Ireland.
We are the Republican movement because we took the principles and all the ideals and beliefs of the Republican movement with us. We are not the dissidents, the Provisional are the dissidents. We are the Republican movement.
There may be some political differences, but when it comes to terrorism, the Real IRA and Continuity IRA work together. John Mooney is writing a book about Michael McKevitt, the man alleged to have founded the Real IRA. He believes the links between the two groups are growing.
They may hold difference of opinions on politics and their political outlook and the best way forward for their own organisations, but they still cut from the same cloth. In terms of local ground knowledge, certainly in South Armagh, certainly in East Tyrone and certainly in parts of Derry, there is cooperation.
Spotlight revealed details of the links between the groups 2 years ago when we exposed a joint operation to smuggle weapons from Croatia. The two men involved in the operation were Joe Fee, who's been named in the House of Commons as a leader of the Continuity IRA, and Damien Lawless. He was jailed for 3 years after being arrested at a Real IRA training camp in County Meath in October 1999.
Morning, Lisa.
Morning.
Danny Kennedy is an Ulster Unionist Assembly member in South Armagh. He doesn't care what they call themselves. He believes all Republican terrorists, including the Provisional IRA, are working together.
I can see differences at political level. The difficulty is for people like me and for others, the Unionist population living in South Armagh, at local level they see little or relatively little difference between those groups.
Unionist fears are fuelled by comments like those made by a Sinn Féin MP after a dissident attack last month.
We haven't seen any progress in demilitarisation. Areas like Fermanagh and Tyrone have been remilitarised. We have a huge amount of military personnel on the roads, stopping cars all the time here, and that feeds in to this kind of scenario. And I believe that had the Good Friday Agreement been implemented, then the people who carried out last night's attack wouldn't have done so.
Remarks like that have led to some unionists claiming that violence by dissidents is being used by Sinn Féin for political leverage. But while there's evidence that individual members of the Provisional IRA have helped the dissidents, senior security sources say there's no evidence of a coordinated strategy. Sinn Féin's opponents point to the experience of Mickey Donnelly as an example of the hostility between them. He opened the first Sinn Féin branch in Derry and was a close ally of Martin McGuinness.
I was attacked by a gang of men who came in through the door at the side here, dressed in black balaclavas on, carrying iron bars, 2 guns, claimed they were from the Provisional IRA. We managed to beat them back out the door again, and at that stage, because we were beating them out the door, one of the people from the back fired a shot, held a gun above everybody's head and fired a shot, and the bullet passed through everybody between my children. And while I was fighting with one hit me with an iron bar and smashed my leg, and when I fell down, another one hit me again with an iron bar. Then they ran out. They left the trail because we had injured 2 of them and fought back.
Donnelly is no longer a member of any dissident group, but was chairman of Republican Sinn Féin in Derry when he was attacked. He says he was targeted for calling Martin McGuinness a traitor. Sinn Féin denies the claim.
My wife went to his house and asked why the attack on me and our family. Why did you order it? Why did it happen? And he said, because he got very excited and he said, because that man has been calling me a traitor this past year. And she says, and what's the problem with that? You are a traitor, aren't you?
I happen to know that there's a different version of events, which, I mean, I'm not going to say because I wasn't involved in it, but there's an absolutely different version of events in Derry about that particular set of circumstances.
Sinn Féin's Republican opponents claim they've been subjected to a campaign of intimidation. They say the murder of Joseph O'Connor, a Real IRA member shot dead in West Belfast in October 2000, was part of that strategy. Republican Sinn Féin's office in Belfast has been attacked and members of dissident groups have been abducted, assaulted and threatened. A number of bars have cancelled functions to raise money for Real and Continuity IRA prisoners because of threats from the Provisionals.
The only people they want to exist within these nationalist communities are the provosts. The only people that are allowed to have a voice are the provosts. But unfortunately, we're here, we're a thorn on our side, and we're not going to be moved or intimidated by them or anyone else.
They will want to blame somebody for the fact that their support is dwindling away, but it's not down to intimidation, it's down to common sense within the Republican constituency, and most people have told them to get real, to get, just to get sense, and to see that they are simply wasting their times, risking their own lives and risking ordinary, innocent people's lives in a futile campaign.
So how much of a threat do the Real IRA and Continuity IRA pose? They've retained separate command structures, but senior security sources on both sides of the border say they're increasingly working together. Their combined strength is believed to be around 400. They're actively recruiting, targeting and trying to buy more weapons. They clearly have the capacity to kill, but can they mount a sustained terrorist campaign? The Real IRA is actively targeting Catholics who've joined the new police service. The Army Council member who spoke to Damien O'Connor said nationalist members of the policing board would also be regarded as so-called legitimate targets.
I asked him if he considered members of the policing board and district policing partnerships as being members of the Crown Forces or the British War Machine, as I put it. And he said, yes. I said, would it therefore not be a reasonable assumption to make that these people would therefore be legitimate targets given that the Crown Forces are considered to be legitimate targets? And he said, that would be a reasonable assumption to make.
Tim Pat Coogan is an authority on the IRA. He doesn't believe that dissidents will turn their guns on other Republicans because it would result in a bloody feud. But he says history suggests Sinn Féin will use the law against their opponents if they join the policing board.
Once they went legit, they had to wear the boots, they had to go whatever came along. The question is, will they support the police force? And I would imagine that in the situation where a deal is done, the answer is they would.
Those Republicans opposed to Sinn Féin expect their former comrades to turn against them.
They intend to have a mopping up exercise as they see it. Once Sinn Féin takes their seats on the policing board, which they undoubtedly will do, and they will try to sell it to their grassroots as another tactic on the long path to the Republic. Their persecution of Republicans will become more evident. I've no doubt about that.
They are now in the trenches of the enemy, and they are about to don the uniforms of the enemy and do the enemy's work. The first duty of any police force is to uphold the state. After that, it deals with law and order, as it's called. But to uphold the state, and the state in Ireland is British rule here.
It can actually be dealt with without anyone having to physically confront anyone by demonstrating to even the most obtuse that politics are working in this place.
For Sinn Féin, dismantling watchtowers like these in South Armagh is essential to demonstrate that politics is working. The party will tell its supporters that their removal is a tangible sign that they're achieving British withdrawal. But the dissidents want to undermine that process. They argue that removing the towers is evidence that Republicans have surrendered and will actually represent a strengthening of British rule in Ireland.
In the wider picture of things, British Army are not leaving here. British government are very clear in that. British Army are not leaving here. They will have garrisons dotted throughout the country, and they are involved in a process of normalisation to create the perception that British rule in Ireland has now become acceptable.
Danny Kennedy doesn't see it that way. He represents an area monitored by the watchtowers and says they're essential for security.
They are a major deterrent to paramilitaries, particularly Republican paramilitaries in that area, from engaging in illegal and murderous activity. Republican dissidents in groups like Continuity and Real IRA do clearly pose a very real threat and a very significant threat.
Danny Kennedy supports the Good Friday Agreement, but he's deeply concerned about the security implications of the political deal his party has now been asked to endorse. Sinn Féin insists that the towers are no longer necessary and accuses unionists of using the existence of dissidents as an excuse for blocking political progress.
The very continued existence of lookout towers in key Republican constituents feeds more into the argument of the dissidents than it does to countering any threat from the dissidents.
Well, I think there's a very real danger that for reasons of political expediency the Prime Minister will allow himself to be duped into conceding action on the military towers without the clear evidence and the proof that is there that Republicans have given up the armed struggle. And by Republicans we mean all Republicans.
Public opinion within the Republican constituency is the best guarantee. Not watchtowers, not more security, not holding back, but moving forward and demonstrating that these microgroups are not as important as they think they are, nor will they be used as an excuse for slowing up the process of change.
If political agreement is eventually reached, Sinn Féin will be expected to join the policing board. If that happens, it'll be the first time Republicans will have endorsed the police in Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin will have to shed any association with violence or illegal activity. In the eyes of the dissidents, the move will make Sinn Féin part of the British state, a state they regard as the enemy.
They have no strategy, and whilst they retain the capacity to grab headlines from time to time and indeed to inflict great hurt, as we've seen in past, it is quite clear that they do not enjoy popular support within the Republican constituency.
Even other Republicans opposed to the Good Friday Agreement don't think the dissidents offer a realistic alternative. Tommy McKerney is one of them. He has impeccable Republican credentials. 2 of his brothers were IRA members killed by the security forces, and the 3rd was murdered by loyalists. He's a former commander of the IRA in County Tyrone and was sentenced to life in jail for murdering a part-time member of the UDR.
It would be quite absurd for these groups to believe or hold out any hope to make a positive contribution to the situation as it stands at present. Devoid as they are of support in its widest sense, and realising that when the Provisional IRA, with all its support and all its resources, was incapable of ultimately breaking the British connection, they are preventing any Republican alternative coming forward, in the sense that by pursuing a very deeply unpopular agenda, they are denying an alternative option the chance to emerge.
There are even divisions within the dissidents. In October, Real IRA prisoners in Portlaoise, including the group's alleged leader Michael McKevitt, issued a statement calling on its Army Council to stand down. It accused leaders outside the jail of being more interested in crime than politics. The Army Council accused those inside the jail of treachery. It claims to have the support of the majority of the organisation's members and access to its weapons.
The people who are now in charge of their weapons, the people who are now in charge of the bombs, the people who are now capable of building and detonating these large car bombs that have maimed and murdered dozens of people are firmly committed to violence.
David Caldwell is the only person to be killed by dissidents since the Omagh bombing, but senior security sources say the level of threat is much higher than that suggests. They estimate that more than 60 soldiers could have been killed if bomb attacks on army barracks in Derry and Ballykelly had succeeded. Dozens of other attacks have also failed or been foiled. The security forces believe the dissidents are preparing to escalate their attacks in a bid to destabilise the peace process. The British and Irish governments are planning new laws to deal with the growing threat. In addition to further bomb attacks, the security forces fear that increased targeting of individuals could be preparation for a campaign of assassinations. They don't believe the dissidents have enough support to mount a sustained campaign, but that could change.
Given the strength of the Irish physical force tradition, no lighted match in a room where there are petrol fumes can be regarded as irrelevant. Now, the match is burnt very low. They're not a serious threat, but it could change. There's some place to go if people suddenly get disaffected with the major thrust of Sinn Féin.
Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern hope that won't happen. They want to broker a political settlement that would lead to a return to Stormont and to the demise of the IRA. But they know that others are waiting in the shadows, hoping that they fail.
We have to build the Republican movement and stick to our principles and ideals and move on from there. But I have no doubt that we will succeed. I mean, I am as convinced that we'll succeed as I was the day I joined the Republican movement.
As long as the British government remains in Ireland, there will be resistance to it, and there will always be a revolutionary movement in Ireland. That is the teaching of Irish history. Anyone who bothers to study it will see that.
Where 2 or 3 Republican activists are gathered, there will always be the potential to wage war against what is called the British presence in Northern Ireland, and I think that potential remains, and I think the government ought to be aware of it and ought to make sure that it's not appeasing it, but it's opposing it.
If we deliver on the Good Friday Agreement and implement it in full, then I think the political changes that will flow from that will completely dry up whatever reservoir of support these people have, because, you know, their cause is inherently hopeless.